The racial and economic disparities that have long existed in this country have only been widened by the coronavirus and amplified by the most recent acts of injustice. People around the world are coming together with greater urgency to demand action. At Bank of America, we know we all have a role to play to overcome the very real consequences of systemic racism and inequity. This includes individuals, governments, nonprofits, and the private sector. Racial equality and economic opportunity are deeply connected. That's why Bank of America has committed $1 billion over 4 years to address critical gaps in affordable housing, access to healthcare, employment and job skills, and the resources small businesses need to succeed. We can do more, and we need to do more now to further advance racial equality and economic opportunity for all.
Hello, and welcome to the Chamber's Economic Outlook event. Before we kick it off to Dr. David Altig with the Federal Reserve in Atlanta, I'd like to take a few minutes to say thank you. Thank you for your resiliency, your courage, your innovation, and your resourcefulness this past year. 2020 was one that we will never forget. And because of you, our partners, our members, our elected officials, your tenacity, your courage, and your leadership have enabled us to continue to be strong during these most challenging times. I'd like to highlight a few things that the Chamber worked on this past year. First of all, we listened to you. You told us at first you needed information on the local, state, and federal level, and we responded. And as of late, we're super excited about our numbers and the launch of Chattanooga Calling. Because our economy continues to be strong, although we've had a lot of small businesses and others who have not done so well right now, and our hearts go out to them. But right now we are focused on trying to find jobs for those who are unemployed and find that link for those companies who have openings and they desperately need workers. So Chattanooga Calling is about linking people who need jobs with companies who have jobs. So please share the URL, chattanoogaCalling.com. So far, we've had 6,000 unique visitors on the site looking for jobs. We've had 10,000 searches and 30,000 page views on the site. We'd also like to recognize the Regions Foundation for their partnership and pulling together a new program in partnership with Chattanooga State, who provides the training, and with area employers. This new partnership is called Skill Up, and we had 26 graduates, 100% graduation rate in our most recent class, all of whom are now employed by 3 area partners: Chattanooga Bakery, Gestamp, and Southern Champion Trade. So thank you to our partners in that program for the work you are doing at changing lives. And I'll tell you, I've had a chance to read some of the thank you notes from the students, and they are inspiring, and their stories are inspiring. And so we hope to be able to provide more of these opportunities in the future with your partnership. I'd also like to talk a few numbers. 2020, despite its challenges, we still had some success. Because of our dynamic economic development team and our elected leaders who partnered with us, we were able to announce 1,067 new jobs in Hamilton County. Because of that, not only were those jobs here in Hamilton County, but we also had several hundred more in the region. So thank you for that great news. And those jobs aligned with $676 million in capital investment in Hamilton County alone, and $767 million in our region. And several of those companies were actually in our targeted industries, which were identified in Chattanooga Climbs, our economic development and talent development strategy. Well, we've had a challenging time in the last week, horrific week last week, but I continue to be ever inspired by the work that I see here at the local level. We continue to focus in on how we can make our economy great, but it will take all of us in the future weeks and months ahead, continuing to wear masks, social distancing, and washing our hands. We know it's so important to keep our economy open, and we hope that you will partner with us and to enable us to do just that. So with that, thank you so much for your partnership and your friendship, and we wish you all the best in 2021. Please enjoy the program today.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to join you, even in a slightly different way. First, let me say thank you to Christy Gillenwater for her leadership at the Chamber in this really challenging year. Let's address the number one economic factor in 2020, the pandemic. Many of us have experienced the impact of the coronavirus in different ways. And for those of you that have been personally impacted, my sympathy. For those of you whose businesses have been impacted, please know that we have done everything possible to work with you and will continue to do so. We had a remarkable economic development story at the start of 2021. During the past decade, we have had businesses invest $4.3 billion in our community, with 66 new companies and 130 expanding businesses, creating a total of 19,398 new jobs within Hamilton County. Little did we know that 2 months later, everything would change. We are aware that the shutdowns or the stay-at-home orders had a devastating impact on our businesses, both small and large. This is why in July, after looking at the escalating coronavirus case numbers, we decided to implement a mask mandate. And we understand a lot of people did not like it. I don't like wearing a mask, but we thought that a mask mandate would not only help protect the health of our people, but would also be a lifeline for our local businesses. The mask mandate has allowed businesses to reopen, for retail stores to welcome people back in, and for our public schools to be able to open on time, and students to attend in person for 84 days in the first semester. That's great work by Dr. Brian Johnson and his staff. And we know that our sales tax figures, people have been adjusting to our current reality, and they are still spending money. We know that unemployment numbers are back to where they were in the 2017 levels. Our November unemployment rate was 4.7%. That is a 2% drop from the previous month. I want to say how much I appreciate the ingenious ways that people realign their businesses to meet the standards of our health directives. For example, restaurants created curbside service and opened outside patios for dining. We also know people have come around on the mask mandate issue, as they understand that the mask not only protects you from me, but me from you as we wait for the vaccine to be more readily available to everyone. Our health department has been outstanding in their efforts to protect our public's health. As in all things, whether it is the testing or the distribution of the vaccine, there have been growing pains. We are now testing an average of 1,000 people every day at our Austin site. And as of today, the health department has vaccinated 6,330 people, and our local hospitals another 9,200, for a total of 15,530 people. We started the vaccinations just before Christmas and continued as vaccines are made available to us. But allow me to say this, if we had a supply, we would vaccinate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at multiple sites. However, with the limited amount of vaccine and the short notice of its arrival, we can only vaccinate a small portion of our population at this time. But as we move further into this year, we will get more vaccinations. We will turn the corner, and it is my sincere hope that by summer we will be somewhere near normal. As we move through these months, we will continue to bring economic development into this community. We have had some significant expansions in 2020 by Southern Champion Trade, Gestamp, and McKee Foods. We hope to announce more in the coming months. We also continue to have discussions regarding the potential purchase of the McDonald farm. We are currently doing our due diligence on the property and working with the McDonald family to settle on a price. Allow me to mention the Business Development Center, a partnership between county government and the Chamber, where startup businesses get assistance from numerous sources, helping them to become successful. The BDC remains a source of great pride for us as we continue to nurse businesses as they can be successful to go to Main Street. To date, 620 businesses have moved from the BDC to Main Street, and currently we have 177 people employed at 41 of these businesses, 16 of which are women and minority owned. Finally, let me say just a few words about our school system. We again say thank you to Dr. Johnson for his leadership, and another great example of that would be the Connect Ed initiative, which has now connected over 11,000 students who did not have internet access. Our thanks to all the foundations who partnered with the EPB Schools initiative. This is another great example of a public-private partnership which we have in this county, so great over the last decade, and while we are meeting our current challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, I am an optimistic person, and I believe we will move beyond our current challenges and find success in the near future. Thank you for your continued work, and thank you for working together.
Thanks to Christy Gillenwater, Charles Wood, and the rest of the Chamber staff for their work over the last year. In really difficult times, as always, they've put the best interests of our community at the center of their efforts. For the last 8 years, I've worked to ensure more Chattanoogans have control over their lives. Too many people feel like they are living on the edge and they don't have the ability to live the life they want because they're always trying to pay their next mortgage or credit card bill. That feeling that much of your day is spent doing what you have to do rather than what you want to do is far too prevalent in our country. For our city, economic development is critical to changing that story, for ensuring families have the economic power they need in their lives. So we need businesses of all types in all corners of Chattanooga provide paths to the middle class for more of our residents. Large manufacturers at Enterprise South and neighborhood restaurants in St. Elmo. Tech companies in the Innovation District and clothing shops in Eastdale. I was so gratified when at the beginning of 2020, Forbes predicted we would be the #1 city for job growth last year. While the year did not turn out exactly as we expected, we've been building a city that offers more opportunity for all. With one of the highest wage growths in the country and multiple growing sectors, Chattanooga continues to be a great place to live and work. COVID-19 has challenged that for us and every American city. When a pandemic shakes our foundation, the people who are holding on at the edge fall off first. That's certainly what we've seen, and our service and hourly workers have been the hardest hit from the coronavirus. Over the last several months, city government has been working alongside the Chamber on an economic recovery alliance. Led by Kimberly Bowen, Vice President of Global Talent at Unum, and Tiffany Robinson, CEO of Lamppost Properties, the group has been charged with planning for our coming post-pandemic world, understanding that nationwide, we're losing about 800 small businesses every day. Even in the darkness, though, we can build our community back in the image we want to see when the light returns. A city that is fairer and more prosperous than before. One where more Chattanoogans live a middle-class life rather than struggle from paycheck to paycheck. Part of that is going to involve making sure more people are trained for the jobs of the future. ChattanoogaCalling.com, a website from the Chamber, helps connect unemployed local residents with job training opportunities. And in every recession, people are looking to go back to school, so Chattanooga State and UTC will see more students. In the long run, if we push for 21st century jobs, if we continue to orient economic development around a living wage, and if we upskill our residents, there is no limit to what we can accomplish. Much has been gained over the last several years, and the fundamental advantages we have persist, despite the setbacks of COVID-19. Our community is at its best when we set our North Star and pull together to turn it into reality. This year will be no different. I wish each of you a healthy and happy 2021.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today at our Economic Outlook Breakfast. Today, we're going to be speaking with David Altig, PhD. He serves as Executive Vice President and Director of Research at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. In addition to advising the bank president on monetary policy and related matters, Dr. Altig oversees the bank's research division, which includes the bank's team of economists, the Regional Economic Information Network, and the bank's Community and Economic Development function. In this role, Dr. Altig leads the Atlanta Fed's research and engagement portfolio on benefits cliffs. He also served as a member of the bank's management and discount committees. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Altig.
Thanks, Jeremy. Glad to be here. And I've had the privilege of doing this talk several times for the Chamber. I wish that this was as usual in person, as I presume we all do, but we're going to make the best of it and hope that next year is going to look somewhat more personal than this one does. In any event,
yes.
Yeah.
And I would like to say up front here for folks, obviously we are recording this on Zoom. We're recording on January the 4th. So I know there's some info that's going to be coming out between now and the time that this actually airs for folks that might be relevant. So I did want to throw that out front. But with that, yes, thank you so much for agreeing to do this, even in the odd circumstances, Dr. Altig. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much again. And yeah, hopefully my forecast that I'm going to talk about today won't be completely obsolete within a week. I'm sure it probably will be within 12 months, but I think between now and the next week, we'll probably be in pretty good shape. But I say this always somewhat advisedly, because really the theme of this year's Outlook is this picture here. So this picture is an index of uncertainty that we put together at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta from a survey we do of businesses. That's why it was called Survey of Business Uncertainty. And a similar one I'm showing here in this picture is done by the Bank of England for the UK. And really basically what it is an index constructed from asking businesses their view of the possible outcomes for the next 12 months, next 4 quarters, and the likelihood of those different sorts of outcomes. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a second, but you can see that in the spring of this year, in March and April in particular, when COVID hit, these indexes jumped dramatically. So clearly not just in the United States, but all over the world, in addition to obviously England. No surprise to anyone that happened, and probably no surprise that it has not abated. So this jump in uncertainty is unprecedented, really in most of our memories. These indexes only go back to about 2016. So we missed Brexit, for example, and the immediate impact of that. But this period of time saw the trade wars, saw political events like impeachment happen in the United States, which barely registered in these uncertainty indexes once it's put in the context of the dramatic increase that came as a result of the pandemic and which is still with us. So, I mean, that really is basically sort of the background for everything I'm going to say now, which amounts to really sort of conceding that nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. Not even exactly, maybe even approximately. Despite that, look, I'm in the business of doing forecasts. That's the job I've been given to do by my bosses. So I got a forecast, and I'm not the only one. This is a picture that if you ever heard me talk before, you will have recognized it perhaps. This comes from the Federal Open Market Committee, the group of policy-making presidents and governors in the Federal Reserve who met in December, and as part of their meeting had to do their own forecast for the next not just year, but 3 years. And here are the numbers that basically represent the consensus view of overall growth in the US economy for the next 3 years. So obviously this year is going to look pretty bad. We're going to have a contraction in overall growth that amounts to 3%, despite the fact that the latter part of the year is characterized by not only growth, but very, very rapid growth, over 30% in the third quarter, but not enough to overcome the dramatic falling off of the shelf that we experienced in the second quarter, obviously. And looking forward, the outlook is relatively optimistic. 4% growth next year, and growth that really is above the trend rate of growth, which we think is something like about 2% over the next several years. Despite that positive picture, it's in many ways not quite positive enough to make up for the decline in GDP and the pace of recovery that we needed out of that decline in GDP to even get back to even, let alone where we would have been without the pandemic. So here's sort of a translation. This is not from the FOMC, but from a panel of Wall Street Journal forecasters. But they have very similar growth projections as the ones I showed you in the previous picture. So this just shows you the level, the evolution of the level of GDP over time, according to these forecasts, where 100 here represents where we were prior to the pandemic at the end of last year. And getting back to 100 is when basically we will have recovered all of the activity we lost as a result of the pandemic, and then moving on into gains after that. So basically these projections of 4% growth next year with the negative 2% or so contraction this year means that we'll be back to even where we were at the end of 2019 sometime by the middle of next year if all of this pans out as anticipated. That actually is a much better forecast than you would have seen even a quarter ago. So the good news in all of this is that the view of how quickly the economy is going to bounce back has become more optimistic as time has gone on. Part of that has to do with the impact of the fiscal policy supports have had on the economy. Part of that has to do with the arrival of the vaccines. No doubt, these forecasts would have embedded the news that vaccines are not only available, but are in the process of being distributed. And some of it just has to do with the surprising resilience of the US economy that I think really, really was part of the positive story, if you can find one, from 2020. Here's another way to sort of look at that change in sentiment as we move from the beginning of the pandemic to the end of last year and where we sit today. So this again comes from this survey of businesses that we do. And in April, we asked them for their projections of sales growth going forward. And they give us a bunch of different scenarios, basically what sort of the consensus or middle case is, and for growth in their own businesses, and then a worst case scenario and a best case scenario. So you see back in April, the worst case scenarios were that in the neighborhood of a 20% contraction in sales for the year. And we're going to be nowhere in that range. And right now, the worst case scenario looks like something along the order of 5% contraction, which would be severe, and that would be on the upper end of a continuing recession, but nowhere near the depression level scenarios that were being drawn back in the spring. And what's more, now it's the case that there are some pretty significant upside scenarios that businesses are seeing. So optimism is with us among forecasters, and importantly, with this among businesses who at the end of the day are the ones who are going to be driving this boat. As I said, part of the positive story has to do with the arrival of support in the form of the CARES Act and extended unemployment insurance, and it was a big deal. And this is a picture meant to convey how big of a deal it actually was. So the black line there represents going back to February. And again, I'm basing this from the beginning of February. So zero though there represents the level of disposable income, which is defined as basically what people earn in wages and salaries, what they get from other sources of income, plus any benefits they get from the government, minus taxes that they pay, which moved into positive territory in April, at the very worst of the pandemic, and stayed positive as we went throughout the year in terms of changes in income. That's the good news, that black line, but the important news in this picture is the sources of income that are represented by overall changes in income that were enjoyed by households and consumers in the United States. So the blue shaded bars, which are negative there, actually represents income earned by working or running small businesses in some cases. And you can see persistently throughout the period, that was negative. That is, incomes earned in the marketplace were shrinking for the entire year. So if you have incomes that you earn from working and running some businesses that are shrinking throughout the year, how do you get positive income changes? The answer is the CARES Act, those unemployment insurance benefits, and other programs that the government put in place to support households in the private sector throughout the pandemic period that we experienced since March. That's all by way of saying that as we went into these forecasts for this year and we're drawing in December, early December, a relatively positive picture about where all this was headed. In many ways, most of those forecasts, I don't know what every forecaster had in their mind, but most of them were conditioned on the arrival of new support for incomes and for spending from the government, which, as we all know now, did in fact arrive at the last minute at the end of the year, which I take to be a very positive development, and one that members of the Federal Open Market Committee were consistently and persistently saying was necessary, and in fact gives some confidence, I think, in the relatively positive outlook for 2020. That, along, of course, with the fact that the vaccine has arrived, and things. I'm not an epidemiologist and I'm not a medical doctor, but it appears to be a reasonable guess that we will be in a position to be moving back towards something that looks very much more like normal by the end of the year. And getting from here to that period of normal, in my view, really did require additional fiscal support, and we got it. And this picture shows exactly how important that was last year and how important I think it will also be this coming year. Maybe we'll get more, maybe we won't, but we did get something to help support spending going forward. One of the things that means is that we are really going to have to change our attention sooner or later as the year progresses towards some longer term issues. And those longer term issues may in part have to do with the very differential impact across the economy that the pandemic itself brought. So here's a picture of retail sales. Again, I've started off sort of in February, pre-pandemic period, and traced in different sectors of the economy the trajectory of retail sales as we went throughout the year. So you see there are some of these sectors, building materials, food and beverage stores, non-store retailers, that is non-brick and mortar retailers, who not only have ended up the year in positive territory with respect to retail sales relative to the pre-pandemic period, but in fact, in many cases, never even suffered a downturn. That in contrast to brick and mortar stores, food and service restaurants and bars, gasoline stations, all of the suspects that you might think and that you know struggled throughout the period, having a very much different experience. And still, none of the people in those pit sectors that I've described here have even gotten back to pre-pandemic levels or are moving in that direction. And this is one of the things that really have sort of where our attention is focused on as we think about the economy going forward, is how persistent and or maybe even how permanent some of these changes in the underlying structure of the economy are going to be. And this is manifesting itself in some important way in the labor market. So here again is a bunch of different sectors, and this is basically about the employment experience in those different sectors throughout the economy. So in total, essentially we lost 16% of the jobs that we had as a result of the pandemic at the very beginning between February and April of last year. And we've recovered about 60% of that. But you can see across sectors what you know, that the distribution of that recovery and loss, or loss and recovery, has been very different depending where you sit in the economy. So in the leisure and hospitality sector, 50% of jobs were lost. And although we've recovered about 60% of those, that is a very, very large hit. In contrast, you look at something like construction, which suffered a 14% loss, and has recovered up near 75%. So again, the big question is whether or not this sort of difference in experience is going to last and be with us for a long period of time, and what that might mean in terms of the policy response that will be necessary to make sure that everybody shares in the recovery that we hope is coming. So I want to dig into that a little deeper and talk about the differential impact across the skill distribution of jobs in the economy. So I want to think about low skilled jobs, middle skilled jobs, and high skilled jobs. This is not about the skills of the people, but rather the skills required in the job. So think about low skill as basically sort of restaurant jobs and service sector jobs. Middle skill would be manufacturing and construction, and high skill jobs would be professional technical jobs, management, those sorts of things. So these bars here represent what it looked like in February of last year, 2020, in terms of the shares of jobs represented in each of those skill categories within the economy. So you can see that the high skilled jobs and middle skilled jobs were each about 40% of the total number of jobs in the economy, a little bit more. And low skilled jobs were about 18%. Despite that, what the orange bars here show is the percentage of job losses suffered in each of these skill categories. So the picture that I want you to see out of this is that despite the fact that low skilled jobs are a minority of the jobs in the economy, they've taken more than their proportionate share of hits during the pandemic and as a result of the pandemic, as you would suspect, knowing that these low skill jobs are primarily these service sector jobs, can't be done remotely. There are restaurants that have gotten closed down, movie theaters that have been shuttered, and so forth. The thing about this is that this is not really the common experience of a recession. So if I go back to the previous recession, the Great Recession associated with the global financial crisis between December of 2007 and June of 2009, it was a very, very different story. And that's the gray bar. In fact, low-skilled jobs continued to increase throughout that recession, and by far, most of the jobs lost during the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 were in these middle skilled jobs, manufacturing and construction. Apropos, the nature of that recession hitting hard the manufacturing and construction sector. In fact, job losses among middle skilled jobs were more than 100% of the total job losses during that recession. And the point I'm going to make here, want to make here, is that this is a problem, a dislocation among certain types of jobs that are with us today and now have been added on top of the challenges associated with finding low-skilled jobs or finding the opportunities for people in low-skilled jobs on the other end of this recession. And one way to see this is in this picture, which starts back in 2007 now, so 100 here on the vertical axis is the level of employment in each of these categories of jobs before the 2007 recession. And then I've traced it right up until November of this year. By the time you see this, we will see another jobs report, but I don't expect this picture to be changed materially. And you can see the blue line, that's the low-skilled jobs, so the falling off of the cliff of the level of low-skilled jobs and the number of low-skilled jobs in the economy, which has not really changed or has not recovered completely. As you can see, we're not back to the level we're at. and actually was true of every category of jobs, but really very, very dramatically in those low-skilled jobs. But the thing that really sticks out about this picture is that there was never really a middle-skilled job recovery. And there was still a pretty sharp middle-skilled job recession this time around associated with the pandemic. So my bottom line message here is there was a huge challenge in labor markets of skilling people up, getting people into the new types of occupations that are available for the new economy, whatever it might look like, that existed even before the pandemic, and now that problem has gotten even worse. So, and my last little message here is that one of the things that means is that efforts like Chattanooga Calling, development efforts aimed at workforce development and placing individuals into the jobs that will characterize whatever the economy looks like on the other side of this pandemic is just critically important. And I kind of commend everyone in Chattanooga for their efforts in this regard. And I just want to make one little point based upon some work that we do at the Atlanta Fed. And you've heard me talk along these lines before, if you've ever listened to one of my speeches before. But I want to emphasize the public return to getting this all right and having an effort like Chattanooga Calling. So here's a simple picture of that involves thinking about a young mother with 2 children working at a minimum wage job who's receiving some public benefits. And what happens if we can move her up into a job with more mobility, with higher pay, and with more opportunities. So I'm here thinking about career advancement from a minimum wage job to one of the emphasis points in your area, which is technology. So this is thinking about the return to the taxpayer from moving someone from a minimum wage job up to become a computer support specialist, for example. And the way to read this chart is that the 5-year return to the taxpayer from someone successfully moving up such a career pathway is about $75,000 in present value. The 10-year return, $150,000, and the lifetime return, $375,000 for one person moving into a better paid and higher opportunity occupation as a result of your workforce development efforts. There is this huge challenge ahead, and you've heard me talk about benefit cliffs before, and the fact that one of the returns that is represented in this picture is that you have people who will no longer be in public benefits, but that's a bit of a problem for them. So what I want to emphasize in my closing comment here is that the opportunity to the public and the return on investment to the public is enormous. And any amount you can spend over someone's, and this hypothetical person's lifetime, less than about $375,000 is a net gain for the taxpayer, a net gain for your community, and a net gain for the economy. And again, we had some very nice conversations with folks at the Chamber, thinking about how we might partner from the Atlanta Fed, doing the sort of analytic and research that we do to address what I think is going to be the most important question for the next several years, once we get over the important question of how do we get through this pandemic. So thanks very much. And I'll turn this back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Dr. Altig. Fascinating. and from my perspective, a little unexpected, to be honest, that things look as positive as they do on the growth front. So I did want to run through a few questions with you, if that's okay. Um, Along those lines, heading into this crisis, economic fundamentals were strong. How might that affect the timing and strength of any recovery we see on the other side of this?
Well, I mean, I think one of the, one of the reasons that we were all surprised by how quickly the economy began to bounce back from the pandemic was, in fact, we were in a very good place prior to the pandemic. All of the weaknesses and imbalances that you typically see around the time of recession were simply absent. Consumers weren't over indebted, businesses weren't over indebted. The government had a lot of debt and got a lot more as a result of this. But even there, found ourselves in a good position to be able to supply the kind of support that is taking us from point A to B with plenty of pain, but far less pain than I think many of us feared. And you saw those sort of worst case scenarios that businesses were reporting in April. So, oh my goodness, we could, in my business, I'm looking that I may be losing a fifth of my total sales, and nothing like that materialized. And I think that has to do with we entered this, thankfully, from a position of strength and resilience.
Okay. And you mentioned up top, the difficulties of being a prognosticator, especially right now, with how fluid everything is. Are you and the Fed watching closely for signs of recovery or more stalling out in the economy?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we're always watching for that. Part of it, of course, is that the usual economic forces are not the big picture. The big picture are have to do with things that we have zero expertise in, and that is, the course of the virus. The policy response to the virus, of course, is important, but even from the point of view of monetary policy, that's largely out of our control as well, and even out of the control of the usual sorts of policy decisions that get made. And I'm thinking about things like shutdowns and decisions to open the economy and the pace at which you do it. So we are, like everyone else, in very, very unfamiliar territory. I guess for the most part, the fortunate part has been the biggest surprises have been positive and not negative as we've traversed through this. The big unknown right now is the vaccine, of course, but I would add that to the upside risk to the economy and not the downside risk. So that's much better. That's much better than we felt, 8 months ago.
Okay. And thank you for the shout out to Chattanooga Calling, by the way. That is appreciated. Sort of along those lines, you and your staff gather a great deal of information from people on the ground, business and civic decision makers, bankers, nonprofits, business owners. What are you particularly interested in learning from your contacts in Chattanooga right now?
Yeah. So in the near term, I think the important questions for us are the ones I alluded to earlier, which is we know that, for example, there are certain parts of the economy, retailers of all sorts, that have taken a very large hit. And it's important for us to know whether or not there is likely to be a sharp return to something that looks like normal when activity and mobility across the economy sort of gets back to normal. So we are sort of struggling to kind of understand how much of the damage that we've experienced over this year can be repaired quickly and how much cannot. And, you know, it's not just retailers, of course. If you think about something like commercial real estate, you know, what is remote work going to look like going forward? And what's that going to do to the demand for office space? Those sorts of questions are absolutely critical to us. And it's important for us that we continue to get feedback as we go throughout this year. And in particular, as we contemplate what happens when the economy really begins to open up in earnest, how fast can we recover, or how slow are we going to have to suffer through the after effects of the pandemic?
Okay. And I know we've partnered with with you folks at the Atlanta Fed a few times on getting surveys out to our membership and stuff like that. So this just kind of underscores how important that is for
Yep.
folks to respond and give us that data when that goes around. I understand the Atlanta Fed has made improving economic mobility and resilience a major priority. Can you discuss how this unusual downturn is affecting our most vulnerable populations and efforts to address this?
Yeah, so that was in many ways what I was talking about when I was referencing the experience of low skill workers um, as a result of the pandemic. It has disproportionately impacted people in lower wage jobs, and really challenged the resilience of individuals to withstand the stress, the financial stress. Now, there have been a lot of policy innovations or interventions that have been very helpful, moratoria on evictions, the willingness of financial inability of financial institutions to sort of kind of help people work through their stress. And, you know, again, I mean, I stressed at the outset the impact of the CARES Act and related, the PPP and related fiscal supports. They were absolutely critical to, I think, you know, in my view, keep the economy from really falling off the cliff. Now those are all short term, and they cannot be sustained forever. So the thing that we're interested in is how do you position people to, with their own resources, weather storms. Hopefully none like this again, but we will see ups and downs in the economy, and we'll see ups and downs in individual circumstances. So, you know, taking those low skill workers, moving them up the skill ladder to higher paying, more resilient jobs, and dealing with the aftermath that I mentioned of the last recession with respect to jobs in manufacturing and construction that were lost, and continuing to provide opportunities for those sorts of people. You know, that's where the story is going to be written in the longer term, as whether or not we can collectively marshal our best thinking to kind of implement successfully those sorts of transitions for people. And our communities absolutely depend upon it.
Well, and you mentioned in your talk, you know, that we're still dealing with the legacy of the last recession, and that's, you know, the downstream effects of that are being felt right now. So I think, when we see data like that that says the unemployment rate is rising, but we hear, I know at the chamber we hear from our members and business owners all the time that they have trouble finding the workers they need right now. How do you reconcile that? What needs to be done to close the gap between employers with job openings that Chattanoogan's are actually looking for?
Yeah, so I think the source of that, I mean, we hear the same, obviously, get the same feedback, get some of it from you. Um, it is paradoxical that you could have a labor shortage in what, in other terms is a labor surplus. Part of it has to do with just simply the weird nature of the shock to the economy. Um, People exposed, there's exposure to being out of your house. And that probably acts as some restraint to people aggressively pursuing some of the opportunities that are available, particularly when you do have some support. I mean, no one, I don't think, is trying to hide the fact that, if the design in part from the beginning of the extended unemployment benefits and enhanced unemployment benefits was to keep people from working, in the sense that that's what we felt was needed, or was felt. I shouldn't say we. That's what was felt was needed to fight the virus. That's almost certainly part of it, but the part that is something for us to address on an ongoing basis is simply the mismatch between the skill set of the labor force and the jobs that are available. You can't. I mean, this was part of the issue with the Great Recession and the financial crisis, which was, you can't take a construction worker and automatically make them an IT worker. That takes an investment, and that takes some time, and that is a persistent story. So if you hear these claims, and they're valid claims in many cases, that jobs are available, but there aren't the people to fill them, you begin to look to your workforce development, economic development programs as the solution, or at least one of the solutions to that paradox.
Okay. And the $1 million question that you knew I was going to have to ask you, what about inflation? Could we see deflation as a result from this crisis? Or might we see inflation as vaccines usher in a recovery and it unleashes pent-up demand?
It's a great question, and if you look at the projections, whether they're coming from the Federal Reserve or whether they're coming from private forecasters, the answer you will get is no, we're not going to see deflation, and no, we're not going to see rampant inflation. It is true that in the short run, the picture is very, very cloudy. Prices have exhibited some of the strange behavior that the entire economy has exhibited as a result of this crisis. Again, if you think of, their zero, demand just falling off of the cliff for some sorts of things, and demand accelerating rapidly, for paper towel and toilet paper, whatever it might be. I mean, those things those things are pandemic-driven anomalies, and they've made it very difficult to read the tea leaves about inflation. I think our view from Atlanta is that there's really no particular signals that we're picking up that there is some significant trend in one way or the other in overall prices. The pent-up demand question is always an interesting one on the other end. So there's some possibility of seeing some price pressures as the economy begins to turn to normal, but it's not clear how fast that return to normal is going to look like either. So it's just as likely you'll consider to see softness in inflation. So, that high level of uncertainty about economic activity translates completely to prices. But right now we're feeling pretty comfortable that if you want a whole list of things that we're worried a whole bunch about, that's probably pretty far from the top.
Okay. And finally, some practical advice. What can we do to make the Chattanooga economy more resilient to future shocks? And is there anything you hope that the policymakers and even the rest of us can learn from this crisis?
Yeah, so I think I've already mentioned it. I mean, I think you're doing it. So Chattanooga Calling is the perfect example of what must be done, and that is that addresses the question of both mobility and resilience. I don't know what you can do to prepare for something like what we saw this time, other than to, you started off, the very first question was, how did the strength of the economy prior to the arrival of the virus impact things? And the answer is, man, it made things probably a whole bunch better than they otherwise would be. So I don't think there's a new formula to be applied and much in the way of new lessons. The most powerful engine of growth for any community is its people. My very last slide was about the return to investment for the public to people, and I think you've grasped that a long time ago, and redouble the effort is the best thing we can do.
Okay, so good times are bad. Invest in people. That's your best way forward.
Yep. Excellent.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you so much for being here today with us, Dr. Altig. We appreciate it. It's fascinating and entertaining every year when we do this. I always look forward to it, and hopefully our members got some good advice that they can take away from this.
Glad to do it. Thanks for asking me.
Thank you so much.
You've been counted out, underestimated, ignored,